they haven't had contact with their families for many, many years. And especially with sexual abuse, people that have been sexually abused, often it's coming in the perpetrators in their own home, or maybe they told somebody in their family and they weren't believed. So again, the sense of isolation is so big. Shame. Mother Teresa once said, loneliness and the feeling of being unwanted is the most terrible poverty. I think so many clients, just being in the system alone elicits a lot of shame, but also too, having gone through trauma, and not just one layer of trauma, it could be layers and layers and layers of trauma, are already coming with a lot of shame when they come to the probation office. So I think it's important that we're really aware of that. Brene Brown, I don't know if anybody's into her books, or she has some TED Talks. She talks a lot about shame, and she says secrecy, silence, and judgment make shame grow exponentially. Lack of trust. Probation officers, our title alone, which I'll be honest, I'm not too comfortable with, we're already in a position of authority, just the officer word. So clients may not be comfortable with that walking into our office for the first time. There's a lack of, there's a real sense of powerlessness or helplessness, especially as they wind their way through the criminal justice system, be it an arrest, going through court, possibly jail. Researchers have said many trauma-exposed individuals typically have histories marked by frequent and wide-ranging fractured relationships. In particular, childhood abuse has been consistently linked with difficulty trusting others, the predisposition to be further traumatized, and the victimization of others. So I think that's also something to be really mindful of. Furthermore, traumatic events can shatter an individual's sense of safety, which can lead to fear and isolation, making it very difficult then to connect with others, including working with professionals such as ourselves. They often feel a sense of powerlessness or helplessness. Again, and jail itself can be further traumatizing. The UN said in 2009 that mentally ill in jail are at constant threat of trauma exposure in so many ways: re-victimization, enforced isolation. As well, just going through the criminal justice system can make people very mistrustful. According to Camera and Mazalis in 2006, they said events or circumstances that echo the violation and lack of control of an earlier trauma can be re-traumatizing. So, for example, we know for that many individuals with a history of trauma being institutionalized, whether in a hospital, jail, or prison itself, can be traumatic. And so many of our clients do get out of jail, and we're the first person they see, so they could also bring that with them when they come to the probation office for the first time. Epstein described trauma as the atom smasher of personality. It can take years to reconstruct one's sense of identity. Further barriers from the client's perspective, denial. I love this quote by, I'm a bit of a addict when it comes to quotes, so forgive me for all the quotes. Robert Frost said, don't ever take a fence down until you know why it was put up. So many clients come in and there's a lot of denial, minimization, maybe not ready to address all that emotional scar tissue, avoidance. According to Luxembourg, Spinazzola, and Van der Kolk in 2001, chronically traumatized individuals often feel that no one can understand their experience, or they may drastically minimize their own experiences as not having a major impact on them, or being unrelated to their current difficulties. So there's a tendency, I think, for some clients to even normalize what's happened to them. Sam says put out a trauma-informed pamphlet for judges in the States, and they quote a trauma survivor who said, I was in the mental health system for 14 years before somebody thought to ask me if I'd been hit, kicked, punched, slapped, or knocked out. When they asked those kinds of questions, I said, oh yeah, sure. But when they asked if I'd been abused, I said, no, it was just my life. And I find that's very true with probation clients as well. Often we'll ask, how was your childhood? And we'll say, oh, fine. And then an hour into the interview or assessment interview, you're hearing about just horrific trauma, but from their perspective, they had an okay childhood. A client's view of talking about trauma could also be failure for many. They may see it as a sense of failure. There's a stigma, which is so huge. CAS Canada is a really great agency. They stand together. They do a lot for trauma workshops. And they talk about, which I found really interesting, ungrievable and ambiguous losses, such as neglect. They said that the most severely stuck and most difficult to work with are those that have been abandoned and neglected. So not necessarily the physical abuse or the sexual abuse, but it's those that are been abandoned and neglected. And they talk about the ungrievable and ambiguous losses. So they talk about the child whose parents are still there, but the mother becomes depressed or has a serious mental illness. She's there physically in the home, but she's not there emotionally. So how do you grieve that loss as an adult, because the mother was still in the home? Or the child who ends up in a gang, whose mother is still in the home but working 3 jobs. Again, how do you grieve that loss as an adult? But for that child, it could be very, very traumatic. Substance abuse from a client's perspective, obviously many of our clients deal with serious addiction issues. So many clients say, if it wasn't for my addictions, I wouldn't even be in the system. There's a self-medicating element to substance use, which is obviously well known. I find this statistic really staggering, the ACE study, that men who've experienced 6 or more adverse childhood experiences have a 4,600% increased likelihood of becoming an IV drug user. I mean, that's staggering to me. 4 or more adverse childhood life experiences, and you have over 400% chance of adult depression. Again, this is all stemming back to childhood. Also, we see a lot of complex clients, so it's not just substance abuse, it's also mental health issues. So which is dealt with first? Feliti and Al in 1998, who was very involved with the ACE study, for alcohol, substance abuse, attempt itself. And obviously, when clients come in to work with us, substance abuse, it's a big criminogenic factor, something we really target. And obviously it does increase the risk to reoffend, whether they are using, maybe they'll be stealing, or maybe they make poor choices. But it also makes them also vulnerable to further trauma. Mental health is a big issue for many of our clients. Howard Sapers from the Office of the Correctional Investigator of Canada has identified that a humanitarian crisis exists in regards to the treatment of mentally ill offenders. He suggested the criminal justice system is proliferating the retention rather than the rehabilitation of these people, of this group. There's alternative perspectives, and we'll get into it a little bit more in terms of trauma-informed care, but perhaps we're over-diagnosing people. I'm not a psychiatrist, and Dr. Gosier can speak more about that, but there's alternative viewpoints, which I don't know if it's true or not, but it's interesting to look at. Dr. Charles Whitfield from the States, he's been working with trauma survivors for over 30 years. He wrote a book called Not Crazy, You May Not Be Mentally Ill in 2011. He said most mental health issues are misdiagnosed and mistreated. He said their mental, emotional, behavioral, and relationship problems were the neurodevelopment and pathophysiological results of their growing up, repeatedly abused, neglected, and otherwise traumatized. He said PTSD is not a mental illness or disorder, rather is a normal reaction to an abnormal, i.e. traumatic experience. And he said PTSD often underlies surface problem or mental disorders. He said those with PTSD have an exaggeration of one or more of its features. He said anxiety is a modern code word for fear, depression is a common code word for stuck grief or numbness, and aggressive or violent behavior is a common code word for unresolved anger or resentment. New research is also now proposing a causal relationship between childhood trauma and later adult psychosis. Dr. Whitfield also looked at over 350 peer-reviewed published studies, and he just felt that a mental health system is not aware enough about trauma or skilled enough to handle the symptoms that we get caught up in the diagnosis. He also said the most common form of childhood abuse, which is verbal and emotional, is often the hardest to identify as an adult. Gender, I think, is also an issue when you're talking about trauma, especially for a lot of the male clients. A lot of the literature is focused very much on females in trauma rather than also males in trauma. I think masculinity is an issue. Men come into our office, and what does it mean to be a man, showing emotions, what constitutes weakness, vulnerability, that I can do it on my own. I think women also deal with this as well, but I think there's so much more on men. I remember I had a client who was running his own business and had a lot of issues from his past, but he would use crack cocaine to self-medicate, and he said he'd rather use crack than go to a counselor. He just found it was really unmanly to go and talk about his problems. I think this is also reflected in the literature. A lot of the literature on trauma is really focused on females, and I feel like men are also have experienced a lot of trauma as well. The chivalry hypothesis was really interesting, which basically says that women are treated more compassionately by the media when compared with men. So McGill did a study in 2014, and they looked it was the first time that they looked at women, violence, and criminality. So they looked at over 11, and men, sorry, they compared men who have mental illness who had offended violently, and they compared women who had offended violently and also had a mental illness. And they looked at over 1,100 newspaper articles published over a 6-month period in Canadian newspapers. And what they found was judges, journalists tend to portray men as villains and women as victims. A lot of the articles with the women, it was more focused on recovery as a theme. There were more interviews with mental health professionals and counselors, rehabilitation, whereas with the men, the articles were really focused more stigmatizing on crime, danger, violence, despite the fact that a lot of these men had also experienced trauma themselves. Culture is also another big one. In terms of coming from a culture maybe where strict ideas of masculinity are also reinforced. And I love this quote by Frederick Douglass. He's from the 1800s, but I think it's so true today. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So now we'll move into trauma from the probation officer's perspective and maybe barriers from our end in terms of what we're doing. So I think the misuse of language is really big. Our ministry is so big on labels and acronyms. Often there's language about, clients we work with are offenders, repeat offenders, recidivists, sex offenders, and domestic violence offenders. I heard a colleague a couple months ago said, well, at the end of the day, there's always going to be some that are just plain criminals. I think the way questions, also too, there's a form we, as all the probation officers know, we have to get a client to sign off on a form when we meet them for the first time, and we review the conditions and we caution them. And at the bottom, we have to get them to sign their name. And I always cringe because they say, well, where do I sign? And it says offender, which I find would be very stigmatizing and labeling. They're already coming in with so much. I think the way questions are posed to clients is really key, or our own discomfort asking questions is also big, or even our own views of trauma or failing to acknowledge or look for it. So when Dr. Gosier asked myself and 3 other probation officers to go through our caseloads, I have a colleague who's been a probation officer for almost 30 years. She's a wonderful mentor to me. Her clients love her. The work she does with them is just wonderful. And so I really look up to her. And she's come to me twice now in the last year. Before we asked her to look for trauma in the caseloads, she kind of approached her caseload thinking, nobody's got trauma. Like, there's all these other issues, but nobody's got trauma. And she said to me, since she did this exercise and actually looked for trauma, she now looks at her caseload and all she can see is trauma. And this is after 30 years of being a probation officer. She's already doing such wonderful work, but I think just that heightened awareness makes that work with her clients even better. And also too, a barrier for us may be trying to get our clients to see trauma when maybe they don't even identify it yet, or too much positivity. I actually had a client recently, a mutual client, who I think I was too positive, and I think because she'd experienced trauma, it was actually, wasn't helpful, I don't think. So I think that's important as a probation officer, not to be too positive, to really work with where they're at. And as Kierkegaard said, once you label me, you negate me. I think internal blind spots are internal bias or narratives. I've often heard, oh, that client will never change. Oh, that client will never change. It's not always easy. There's sort of topics of somebody's life where they maybe are in turmoil or chaos, and maybe we don't see what can happen down the road. But I think it's important for us to be aware of that. Sandler said some traumatized individuals may attribute an archaic parental role to the probation officer, and that can be obviously very problematic if the relationship is one or maybe abusive, or maybe that parent failed to acknowledge abuse in the first place. Or I think also too, just looking at certain things in a singular fashion, such as just focusing on substance abuse or anger management. It's like my colleague; she has the awareness now that that's just a sort of. Sheldon Kennedy talked about the outer layer of the onion, that underneath that there is a trauma or pain, emotional pain from their past. I think taking clients' behavior personally, I think we put a lot of work in probation officers. I think we're doing such great work. Really do think what we do is wonderful. But I think you put all this work into somebody and maybe he lied to me, or maybe they reoffend, and sort of taking that personal when really it doesn't really have much to do with us. For all you Leaf fans, I don't know, we snuck in a sports quote in there, but I think it's sort of relevant, just to see if people are paying attention and reading. So yeah, Mike Babcock, Leaf coach, said, I don't coach hockey players, I coach people. So failing to separate the person from their behavior. I think it And I think too, especially people that have been exposed to trauma, they're so sensitive to our energy. I think, 90% of communication is nonverbal. So, I mean, just when we open that door and we ask the client to come in for the first time, they pick up on our energy like that. There's a hypervigilance, there's a sensitivity that they pick up on that I think we really need to be aware of, especially if we're having not such a great day. Misunderstanding clients' behavior, being judgmental, and I really thought this was interesting. Chronically traumatized individuals may have only intermittent ability to access certain information. They may be very forgetful, they may appear to space out, or they may retreat within themselves when confronted with painful emotions or reminders of the traumatic experience. They often have difficulty remembering what was discussed between sessions or forget safety plans or coping skills. I think that's so helpful for us to know, because here you think you're doing all this great work, you have this great appointment, and then you see them 2 weeks later and they can't recall what was talked about. Rigid thinking, inflexible attitudes. Again, a lot of the research is on youth, and in 2011, researchers said that youth probation officers who perceived their clients as non-compliant were actually more likely to use confrontational and coercive approaches, including threatening enforcement and sanctions. Also, from the probation officer's perspective, I think it's important to know your own, we all have issues, let's be honest, and sort of the counter-transference, the emotional reactivity, and how our issues could actually affect somebody's ability to reoffend and get into trouble again. Carl Jung said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. I think that's really important to know. I think a client might actually prefer to incur a new charge of failing to report to their probation officer rather than having to come back to somebody that maybe triggered them in some fashion. I also too, being aware of your own issues. I had one client who had a personality disorder. He was homeless, but there was something about him that triggered me. He'd show up every 4 hours late, and I couldn't understand it. Other clients in similar predicaments, I didn't feel triggered, and thankfully one of my colleagues is a psychotherapist. It was only through talking to her that I realized something that was happening with my client reminded me of my own relationship with my father, and as soon as I realized that, the rapport improved. So I think it's so important to be aware of our own issues and emotional reactivity. And that we can very much actually trigger flashbacks, which relational flashbacks that occur because of how we're interacting with them. Or even just putting that could trigger them if they go use drugs or take it out on their partner. Also too, we're not clinicians, so client tells us something, then what do we do with that? Vicarious trauma, job burnout, I think is really big. There was a client at my office who is being seen for sexual offending and also is at a high risk of imminent violence towards somebody in the community. The previous probation officer, they were sort of engaged in this power struggle, and the client would leave and call the probation officer and say, I'm going to go drink. He's not supposed to drink. I'm going to go down to the pub downstairs. I'm going to drink. And I'm going to go home and hit the victim. And I think about stress on what that would have been like for the probation officer. Every 2 weeks, this client is reporting and how stressful that would have been. He's now seen somebody new, and within a couple appointments, he's tearful and open, and they have a really good working rapport. Trauma-informed care. I never heard of trauma-informed care. I don't know exactly when it all started. I think it was maybe in the 2000s. If anybody can tell me, that would be great. It's a philosophical approach. Going back to that last slide, I just want to say I think as probation officers, how we treat people is so important to be aware of our issues in terms of what we bring to the table. Yeah, hi.
Sorry, just on that topic, I was wondering if I could comment. A few slides back, you spoke about kind of the punitive approach or consequences.
Yeah.
Just curious how that can trigger.
Yes.
In terms of if users coerce, manipulate, groom, maybe the end result. For me as
Thank you. I think that's a great point. So trauma-informed care, it's a philosophical approach for service providers. I know a lot of hospitals are implementing it. I was at a conference last week for CAMH. CAMH has a book out, Trauma-Informed Care. So it's to, according to SAMHSA, having correctional and judicial staff be trauma-informed is designed to help individuals understand how their past experiences shape their behavior and responses to current events. It acknowledges the prevalence and impact of trauma and attempts to create a sense of safety for all participants, whether or not they have a trauma-related diagnosis. It means re-examining policies and procedures that may result in participants feeling loss of control in specific situations, training staff. The goal is to fully engage participants by minimizing perceived threats, avoid re-traumatization, and support recovery. Also in the Jean Tweed 2013 manual for trauma-informed, they talk about the 3 R's: realize the impact of trauma, recognize how it affects everyone, and respond appropriately. The scope of the issue, the majority of people have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. Failing to address the unseen scars from childhood can hinder adults' capacity to meet their potential. Universal precautions, so just being aware. There is a, Nicole Miller in 2011 said, in settings like substance abuse disorder treatment in jails or prisons, it's very likely that the majority of clients are dealing with a mental health consequence of trauma, that we actually need to apply universal precautions at every client encounter possible and at every level of care, whether or not trauma screening is available. So trauma-informed probation, what would that look like? I think Sheldon Kennedy talked about that today, moving from what is wrong with you to what happened to you. There's some handouts that were passed around that talk about what trauma-informed looks like and what trauma-uninformed looks like. Dr. Gabor Mate, who talks a lot about trauma and addictions from Vancouver, said, ask not why the addiction, but why the pain. So substance abuse and criminality then come to be seen as attempts to cope with trauma and its aftermath. Survivors are not doing the best they can do, they're doing what they know how to do. Dr. Mate also said the largest tragedy is disconnection from oneself, which I think when you go through a traumatic experience, that's exactly what happens. So build on existing supervision strategies, new language, moving from offenders to clients, or even clients that offend sexually. Labels can be so stigmatizing. The way questions are asked. The ministry does have a great course right now on working with male victims of sexual abuse. Before I took it, I used to ask the male clients, well, have you ever been a victim of sexual abuse? And everybody said no. And then as soon as I took the training and it was, has anyone ever touched you in a sexual manner that was unwanted, I'm floored by the amount of disclosures I get just because of the slight change in language. So seeing resilience as opposed to weakness, it's a strength versus deficit lens, which I think probation officers often already do. But I think little things are underemphasized. Greer and Scott talk about continuous appreciation of the client's bravery, and I think that's so big. Even sometimes just making it through the door 4 hours late for certain clients needs to be acknowledged. Separate the person from the behavior. So way questions are asked. There is a handout that was passed out, that's put out in the States, and they have one column is probation officer's comment, and you've got the perception of the trauma survivor, and then you've got the trauma-informed approach, and I think it's really helpful. So, for example, a probation officer says to the client, you didn't comply with probation, you're being breached, and you could possibly go to jail. There's nothing more we can do. The perception of the client, the trauma survivor, is, I'm hopeless. Why should I care how I behave in jail? They expect trouble anyway. From a trauma-informed approach, the question would be, maybe what we've been doing isn't the best way for us to support you. I'm going to ask you to not give up on recovery. We're not going to give up on you. So just a very different way to phrase a question. Or your drug screen is dirty. Well, a perception of a trauma survivor would be, I'm dirty. There's something wrong with me. A trauma-informed approach would be, your drug screen shows the presence of drugs. So just a slight change in language. So I really like this picture. So I think it's important to reframe the behavior. Marianne Williamson in a book on the shadow said, all of us are scarred, yet the problems that our scars don't show up as such as other people. Rather, they show up as character defects. If a 3-year-old is screaming and crying, we're likely to say, oh, the poor darling is so tired. But when you're crying and screaming 40-year-old, even if your pain is directly related to your trauma as a 3-year-old, people do not say, oh, he's wounded. They say, he's horrible. Your character defects are not where you're bad, but where you're wounded. And she also said character defects are the way you self-sabotage, the way you hurt yourself and others. And I I think so often we forget about that little child. We just see that angry client sometimes in our office, and it's important to remember that we all have an inner child, and for those that are traumatized, the inner child may be leading the way. Also too, I think a lot of clients do come in and there's this need to want to get clients to take responsibility. Maybe they're blaming other people or blaming victims or whatever it may be. Brene Brown, she also says that blame is just a way to discharge pain and comfort. So from a trauma-informed perspective, we would see maybe, this is just their way to kind of purge some emotion and pain. And also too, Sheldon Kennedy talked about connecting the dots, and sometimes I think that first dot starts with the trauma. So reframing, often there's this, I've heard this language of, well, this client is so manipulative, this client's unworkable, this client's difficult to work with. That could be their only way to exert some sense of control. So a lot of the trauma-informed literature talks about that. So reframing our perceptions of behavior, they're not being manipulative or difficult to work with, they're actually just trying to exert some sense of control. So it's reframing what empowerment looks like, accountability, lying. The research has said deception may be a defense mechanism used to cope with their situation, poor sense of self, or to ward off shame that they already feel. So it's just reframing. It's that slight sort of changing the lens a little bit of a client's behavior. Redefining substance abuse. Johann Hari, in a new book this summer, said the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is actually connection. Which I think is so important because so many probation clients are isolated, so often we can't get the first person to connect with. Dr. Matei says the addiction was their best attempt to cope, so we really need to connect on the heart level and honor their suffering. And back to Johann Hari's book, he says, new addiction research is saying that human beings have a natural and innate need to bond, and when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you'll bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. So he looks at substance abuse as a social disorder, and he said our system makes addicts' life worse, even more disconnected, such as going into jail. He also talked about a study involving rats, where the rats were given heroin water, and I'm sure some of you heard of it, and regular water, and in an isolated cage, and they eventually overdosed. And but then they replicated it with rats in a big social rat park with lots of other rats and social connection, and even the heroin-addicted rats stopped using the heroin once they had that social connection with all these other rats. And so he says addiction is an adaptation to the environment. It's the cage you live in. And So I think, again, our relationship with the client can actually be a really big, strong protective factor, even though our relationship with clients is forced. I mean, they are being told to come see us, but I think the biggest compliment is when a client actually wants to come back sooner. Or when I was covering for other probation officers on duty one Christmas Eve, a colleague's client showed up. She wasn't in. It was Christmas Eve, and he had nobody, and he just wanted to see his probation officer that day. So I think also too, from a trauma-informed perspective, trauma is given equal weighting to male clients as it is to female clients. Last summer, we presented this in brief at a conference, and I met a woman in the federal corrections, and she said that there's very few trauma programs for men in the federal jails teaching, but there's a ton for women, because there's this fear that, well, if we talk about men having gone through trauma, it's somehow an abuse excuse. But Miller and Najavitz, who've done a lot of research on this, said that being trauma-informed can actually begin to be understood as a safety issue rather than the abuse excuse. And also, too, maybe how men might internalize trauma differently, or that men may act out and women may act in. So looking at anger and violence, maybe as a possible symptom of trauma exposure. Also about criminogenic factors that is not really being addressed. Dr. Colin Cameron, who is a psychiatrist in Ottawa, he says, and again, I go back to our stats, the individuals that we surveyed had commit offenses against other people, as Dr. Gosher said, hurt people. So maybe we need to look at trauma as a criminogenic risk factor. There are people that are suggesting this. Dr. Colin Cameron, he runs a forensic program. He's a program director of a 25-bed trauma disorder unit. and he's with the Royal Ottawa Healthcare Group, and he's presented that he feels PTSD contributes to the development of other criminal risk factors such as substance abuse, poor work, school performance, relationship instability. And he said antisocial behavior is a symptom of trauma and or neglect, such as anger outbursts, thrill-seeking, behavioral reenactment, flashbacks, and that antisocial behavior leads to greater risk of trauma from violence. So he really feels that we need to be looking at trauma as a criminogenic risk factor and not just the other factors that are often in our risk need assessments. There was a talk that I heard last year from a Dr. Decker and Alan Vanderbroek in 2014. They work at a forensic hospital with people that have offended very violently and obviously have serious mental illness. And they said you can't even talk about lowering risk unless you talk about trauma and dealing with trauma. And they feel that the risk need principles of just focusing on substance abuse and work and family relationships really are not, that trauma needs to be integrated into these assessments. And they found that that treatment directly related to being trauma-informed contributed to a lesser risk. And there's a new book coming up in 2015, and it's by a professor at Conestoga, and he says that trauma is actually one of the root causes of crime for youths that are involved in the criminal justice system. I think from our perspective, I can say that I think it's also very true with adults as well, not just maybe with the youths. So I think enforcement, reenacting enforcement, especially maybe better understanding in terms of clients that repeat the trauma, the compulsion to repeat the trauma, such as clients that offend sexually, clients that offend against their partners, especially if they witnessed that before. Luxembourg said, and individuals may victimize others in ways that replicate their own traumas, either literally or emotionally. So also just redefining enforcement, charging people. Probation is obviously do have to lay charges sometimes. But with the youth research, they found that approaches to enforcement based on problem solving, incentivizing behavior, counseling, persuasion were much more helpful for those youth on probation rather than confrontation and negative pressure. So not looking at it as enforcement maybe as a negative thing, but also as a learning opportunity. I know whenever I meet a client for the first time, I always say I don't charge you. I think people charge themselves, and I think I've never had a problem from that because I think people are treated as resourceful and resilient. You're more likely to draw that out as opposed to treating them like they're the opposite. I think our response too, because if it's trauma informed, there's a better chance for a positive outcome as opposed to being non-trauma informed. So trauma informed lens, developing clients develop a sense of self and belonging. Again, I think we all do this, but it's just heightening it a little bit more. We all want to be heard, seen, to know we matter. Every interaction then is seen as an opportunity for meaningful engagement. Empathy is so big. Feelings are as important as facts. I find the magical phrase that must have been so hard for you. Clients feel heard and validated. Again, I mentioned my colleague whose client showed up on Christmas Eve. I mean, his only secure relationship at that time was his probation officer. Carl Jung says shame is the swampland of the soul, and Brené Brown said empathy is the antidote to shame. And sometimes we can be their only and possibly first secure attachment, especially if they've gone through the system or come from broken homes. Sheldon Kennedy also talked about hope, which I mean, I really it's so key. Having hope where clients may not have hope. Believing in a client even when that client doesn't believe in themselves. I know I had a teacher that believed in me when no one else did, and that one person can really change somebody's life. And I think as a probation officer, to believe in somebody when nobody else has believed in them can be incredibly powerful. Breer and Scott said, although it's not typically described as a therapeutic goal, the installation of hope is a powerful therapeutic action. And that's not always easy to do when you're seeing somebody wind their way through the system or just struggle with substance and mental health issues, but to always have that sense of hope. So being non-judgmental, providing a safe space for discourse, emphasizing the resilience. Cass Canada says it's not about learning to work with people, but how to be with people. And there's a Persian poet who said, the wound is the place, Rumi, you probably have heard of him, he said the bandage place or the wound is the place where the light enters you. So I think that's important to be mindful of and not just always focus on the wound, but there's potential for light. And I think I was at a Christmas party once and somebody asked, well, what do you do? And I find either people's eyes gloss over when they tell you what to do. they're really interested. And they said, oh, it must be so depressing. I said, no, actually, it's really inspiring because some of the stories of resilience and the ability to face the day when I don't know how they do it. So I think it's sort of two sides of the same coin. Yes, we're dealing with maybe, as Dr. Gosher mentioned earlier in the TED Talk, when the Mr. Ross was talking to people in the inmates, well, I hate to say inmates, men that are in jail, I just caught myself, in California, and he said, most of you are here because your wounds did not heal. So it's also important to focus on, yes, they may be very chronically traumatized, but they're also the most resilient, I think, as well. So it's what side of the coin do we focus on? I have a quote in my office by Nelson Mandela. He said, don't judge me by my successes, judge me by how many times I fell and got back up again. So I think as probation officers, it's important to focus on the positive, even if it may not be that obvious to the client or other people. So where do we shine our light? You know, which side of the coin do we shine our light on? So moving forward, concluding, I know it's been a long day. Thank you everybody for your patience. Dr. Mattei said, not every story has a happy ending, but the discoveries of science, the teachings of the heart, and the revelations of the soul all assure us that no human being is ever beyond redemption. The possibility of renewal exists so long as life exists. How to support that possibility in others and in ourselves is the ultimate question. So moving forward, I think build on the great work of the officers are doing, sharpen their focus a little bit more to maybe really look for trauma. Clients that you thought were manipulative, maybe they're just responding to past trauma. It's their only way to feel a sense of control in a system or a life they may feel completely out of control. Moving from working with offenders to a trauma-informed supervision style. Back in the 90s, BREA recommended that we have a trauma-informed checklist. Looking at trauma as a critical responsibility issue, maybe reducing caseloads, more time to complete assessments. In Hawaii, at the correctional facility for women, they don't even start asking probing questions till the 10th or 11th week. And to conclude, I'll just read out a quote from Tonya Kane. I think there's a documentary on her who had over 83 arrests, 66 convictions, drug addiction. She was sexually abused as a child. She said, during every incarceration, every institutionalization, every court-ordered drug treatment program, it was always the same. I was always treated like a hopeless case. All people could see was the way I looked or the way I smelled. It wasn't until I finally entered a recovery-oriented trauma-informed treatment I felt safe and respected that I could finally begin to heal. Someone finally asked what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. I think Sheldon Kennedy talked about that too. I know there's a lot in the States on being smart on crime as opposed to tough on crime, and I think being trauma-informed is a piece of that. We're often the first contact with traumatized individuals. I think we all want the same result. We all want public safety. We all want safe communities, but I think being trauma-informed can be part of a better way to get there. And while addressing public safety often focuses on criminal behaviors, we need to understand that managing trauma can be the first step in this endeavor. And as Sheldon Kennedy talked about, it's those dots, and maybe we need to start with that first dot. And it doesn't mean that as probation officers we do the work that counselors, but it just means we're more informed. So personal healing can benefit all of society and lowers recidivism as well. I would like to just end with quotes from two men. One of them is the Pope. I don't know if anybody heard him speak to people, men that, see, I want to use the language inmates, but that's not very trauma-informed. So men that are incarcerated in Philadelphia. I don't know if anybody saw his speech. He said, confinement is not the same, and I think this is also true for us working with people on probation. He said, confinement is not the same thing as exclusion, and I should say I think the same thing with probation. Probation is not the same thing as exclusion. He said, it's painful when we see prison systems which are not concerned to care for wounds, to soothe pain, to offer new possibilities. It is painful when we see people who think that only others need to be cleansed and purified, and do not recognize that their weariness, pain, and wounds are also the weariness, pain, and wounds of society. He said, any society, any family which cannot share or take seriously the pain of its children and views that pain as something normal or to be expected is a society condemned to remain a hostage to itself, prey to the very things which cause that pain. So I'd like to end it with a quote by the man who actually introduced the Pope, who's the Commissioner of Prisons for Philadelphia. And while he was speaking from the perspective of correctional staff in the jails, I feel like it's also relevant to us in probation, and they both capture the spirit of being trauma-informed. He said, we who stand in authority understand that love and respect, as well as the spirit of hope and forgiveness, is still both the keepers and the confined. Otherwise, peace and justice cannot be achieved. That's it. Thanks. Thank you.
So we have about 8 minutes until 5 o'clock. Please fill out your evaluations and questions.
Hi, I'm a probation officer. I have a question. I understand everything I agree with it. But working for the ministry, I had a discussion with the probation officer. He saw him up in counseling, and they feel that they can sexually abuse automatically. That means a notice to the police, that automatically means an incident report, that automatically violates and re-victimizes. And this was something that I was battering with the other probation officer. And he said, I'm sorry, my hands are tied. She came in, she finally got into a comfortable situation. This is what she told me, and now, ministry policy. So as a probation officer, sometimes I don't wanna get into those trauma-based situations because it will lead to an incident report or police report or whatever. You understand where I'm
Yeah.
coming from? I'd like to work the way you're saying, but given the traumatization, based on ministry policy, I don't know what you have to say about that.
It's a difficult one.
It's happened to me that clients have actually raised the possibility that they've been sexually abused. And I know the policy that the ministry will want to take action and report it to the police. So it's very important that you lay the foundation at the outset. And as a psychiatrist working for probation, it's quite different as a psychiatrist working outside probation. So within probation, I always have this dialogue with the client that things are not as confidential as you might think it to be with a psychiatrist in this office. However, if there are things that you want to talk about and you feel that you're concerned about, don't talk about it just yet. Maybe you can give you some clues and I can give you some idea as to what my policies are, what my procedures are. And some patients have actually hinted at underlying sexual abuse. And I said there are ways in which we can deal with that without having to invoke the probation officer and reporting to the ministry. I'll find you an independent psychiatrist outside the office. I'll find you a psychologist outside the office. And how you deal with that person is up to you, because now you know what the ministry policies are. Now that's also a tricky issue, because then we are preventing people from actually reporting things. But I think everything that we do from a therapy point of view should be informed, and the client should know what my limitations are as a therapist, rather than become another traumatizer for the person. So it's a very difficult situation, and I think the ministry will start looking at that policy. But it's happened to me on not more than one occasion in this probation office. It's a very good question.
Yeah, it's happened to me as well.
Yeah, and I think it is a very good point. And I think the part of being trauma-informed is even if the client doesn't disclose that to you, it's just that we as probation officers now have that perspective, that awareness that possibly there's something there. So but it is a difficult one, but maybe being trauma-informed within the ministry even, because, because we haven't, I'd love to see more training on probation officers being trauma-informed and from a ministry level, and so maybe that could change these ministry policies in terms of once the ministry becomes more trauma-informed. Not that they're not, but I don't know if anyone here from the ministry, but that just kind of sharpening our vision a little bit more.
I know we're using that trauma-informed word.
Yeah.
I think the key piece that people need to realize is there's more than one person doing the screening. And if you've been traumatized in any way, shape, or form, your radar is incredible. I think the thing with probation or anybody needs to get is you're being screened. It probably might take you an hour and a half to do the screening. They'll have you screened in 5 seconds. Are you going to work with the whole person or are you going to work in part? We don't need necessarily psychiatry, but we need people heal through relationship, through acceptance. The damage that gets done in trauma is usually at the very core relational. And so we need people with just the courage to be in the room, work with the whole person, and show a great deal of respect and patience and attention. So I don't think it's rocket science. I think I don't want to pathologize it any more than it is, but trauma-informed, just get your ears open, sit, listen, and learn.
Just a comment to that point that the last gentleman made. It's it's not rocket science, it's science. And what happens is quite often as medical students, as psychiatric residents and physicians, we open the diagnostic and statistical manual and look at what's trauma and what's complex trauma. But to really capture what complex trauma is, you've got to live the experience, you've got to know the client. And knowing is not just knowing as a cognition, but knowing as Sarah presented it. Knowing from an emotional point of view, knowing it as a relationship, and knowing it as a complete interaction, as opposed to just a cognition, what you read in a textbook. Sorry.
That's okay. Sarah, you mentioned the Tanya K.
Yeah,
documentary. It's actually one of the movies
yeah.
for movie tomorrow. And the other comment I wanted to make was, I know you're not clinicians, and there's probably umpteen million screens that you guys need to do. But when you talked about some of the concrete thinking and inflexibility and zoning out, and all those other comments, I was thinking, how many of these people are living with the effects of a brain injury that has gone undiagnosed because of repeated concussions, post-concussive syndrome? And we're starting to hear more and more about that in relation to concussion sports, and hockey was a big thing on the news last night, where the NFL is finally acknowledging it in terms of football, and what the long-term implications are for people who have CTE. So I think there's a lot more that we need to be asking about in terms of what's going on for people, besides just what happened to you.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the whole picture and this is it. It's just more, it's just a little piece.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but I agree with you completely. Yeah.
Great job.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to 5 o'clock. I'd like to thank Dr. Louise. Thank you, Sarah.